What happens when a billionaire's son fails at everything, despite having every advantage money can buy? When a 24-year-old heir to a corporate empire can't pass a single test, make a single deal, or earn a single dollar on his own. This is the story of Alexander Worthington III, born at the top but living at the bottom of incompetence, and how one unlikely mentor with a mop bucket changed everything. This isn't just about wealth or failure. This is about discovering who you really are when everything you thought you knew gets stripped away. The Manhattan skyline gleamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Worthington Industries' 42nd floor, but Alexander Worthington III couldn't appreciate the view. Not when his father's disappointed gaze burned hotter than the August sun reflecting off the glass towers below. The mahogany conference table between them might as well have been an ocean, separating two worlds that had never quite aligned. 24 years old, Alexander. 24 years, and you failed every single opportunity we've given you. Charles Worthington's voice carried the weight of 3 generations of business success, each word measured like a stock portfolio. The Harvard MBA program rejection, the failed internship at Goldman Sachs, the disaster at the Tokyo merger negotiations where you somehow managed to insult 3 board members in 2 languages. Alexander's Armani suit felt like a costume he'd never learned to wear properly. His hands, soft from a lifetime of privilege, fidgeted with a Mont Blanc pen that had never signed anything meaningful. Dad, I know the Tokyo thing was bad, but I was trying to show cultural sensitivity by bowing, and I didn't realize. You bowed to the cleaning lady thinking she was the CEO's wife. Charles's temples pulsed with barely contained frustration. Do you understand what's at stake here? This company employs 12,000 people. Our shareholders trust us with billions in assets. And you, my only son, my heir, can't distinguish between a board member and maintenance staff. The words stung because they were true. Alexander had spent his life surrounded by tutors, coaches, and consultants, all trying to mold him into the leader everyone expected him to be. Yet every test, every challenge, every opportunity became another spectacular failure that made headlines in the business journals his family had graced for decades. Outside, the city pulsed with ambition and success. Yellow cabs weaved between delivery trucks, while pedestrians in crisp business attire hurried along sidewalks that had been walked by titans of industry for over a century. New York never stopped moving, never stopped achieving, and Alexander felt like the only person standing still in a world that demanded constant motion. I'm giving you one final chance, Charles continued, sliding a thick folder across the polished table. 6 months. You'll start in our acquisitions department, entry level. No special treatment, no family name pulling strings. You'll report to Sarah Chun, and she doesn't care whose son you are. 6 months to prove you can contribute something, anything, to this family legacy. Alexander opened the folder with trembling fingers. Market analysis reports, acquisition targets, financial projections, numbers and graphs that might as well have been hieroglyphics. He'd seen similar documents hundreds of times, had them explained by the best business minds money could hire, but they never made sense. Not really. They were puzzle pieces that everyone else seemed to fit together effortlessly while he couldn't even find the corners. And if I fail again? The question escaped before he could stop it. Though they both knew the answer, Charles's expression softened for just a moment, revealing the father beneath the CEO. Then we'll have to discuss your future outside this company. I won't let sentiment destroy what 3 generations of Worthingtons have built. The elevator ride down to the 38th floor felt like descending into purgatory. Alexander's reflection in the polished steel doors showed a young man who looked the part, tall, well-groomed, expensively dressed, but whose eyes held the hollow uncertainty of someone who'd never earned anything he possessed. The numbers above the door counted down like a timer on his last chance. The acquisitions department buzzed with the energy of people who belonged there. Sarah Chun, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who'd climbed from analyst to department head through pure merit, barely looked up from her computer when Alexander introduced himself. Worthington. Right. You'll be working on the Morrison Industries analysis. Due diligence reports, market comparisons, risk assessments. I need it by Friday. She handed him another stack of documents without ceremony. Your desk is over there. Jennifer will show you our systems." Jennifer, a recent MBA graduate who looked younger than Alexander, but radiated competence, spent the morning explaining databases and analytical tools that seemed designed to expose his every weakness. Her explanations were patient, but couldn't hide her growing confusion as Alexander struggled with concepts she'd mastered in business school. "So you take the EBITDA multiple and compare it against industry standards," she explained for the third time, pointing at numbers on the screen that blurred together like alphabet soup. "Then you factor in the debt-to-equity ratio to assess the acquisition value." Alexander nodded as if he understood, but the truth was grimmer. Despite years of expensive education and private tutoring, despite having every advantage wealth could provide, the fundamental logic of business remained as foreign to him as quantum physics. He was like a man trying to read music who'd never learned that the symbols represented actual sounds. By lunch, panic had set in. The Morrison Industries file sat open on his desk, accusing him with its complexity. Around him, colleagues who earned in a year what he spent on shoes moved through analyses that left him paralyzed. He'd been placed in his father's company, like a square peg being forced into a round hole, and everyone could see it didn't fit. The executive washroom on the 38th floor was his refuge, a marble sanctuary where he could hide from the evidence of his inadequacy. Standing at the sink, staring at his reflection in mirrors that had witnessed decades of corporate triumphs and defeats, Alexander finally voiced the truth he'd been avoiding. "I don't belong here," he whispered to his own reflection. "I don't belong anywhere." The admission hung in the air like confession in a cathedral, honest and devastating. He was a failure wrapped in privilege, a disappointment dressed in designer clothes, a young man who'd been given everything except the ability to succeed. And with 5 months and 3 weeks remaining on his father's ultimatum, Alexander Worthington III began to understand that some problems couldn't be solved with money or connections or family names carved into building cornerstones. 3 weeks into his final chance, Alexander had mastered exactly one skill: finding creative ways to avoid his desk. The Morrison Industries analysis remained as impenetrable as a fortress, despite Jennifer's increasingly concerned attempts to help. His colleagues had stopped offering assistance, their patience worn thin by his obvious incompetence. Even Sarah Chen's professional courtesy was beginning to crack under the weight of his spectacular inability to grasp basic business concepts that IT was during one of his extended bathroom breaks, his 4th of the morning, that Alexander first noticed him. The man was older, maybe 60, with graying hair and hands that spoke of decades of honest work. He moved through the executive washroom with practiced efficiency, replacing towels and restocking supplies with an attention to detail that Alexander had never applied to anything in his life. "Morning," the custodian said simply, not looking up from his work. His voice carried the slight accent of someone who'd learned English as a second language, possibly Spanish, refined by years in professional environments. Alexander mumbled a greeting, uncomfortable with the interaction. In his world, service staff were invisible, acknowledged with the same casual attention paid to furniture or fixtures. But something about this man's quiet competence made ignoring him feel impossible. "You know," the custodian continued, polishing the marble counter with methodical strokes, "I've been working in this building for 15 years. Seen a lot of people come through these washrooms. Successful ones, struggling ones just trying to figure out where they fit." The observation hit closer to home than Alexander cared to admit. He studied the man's reflection in the mirror, noting the calm efficiency of his movements, the way he approached even the smallest tasks with purposeful attention. There was something unsettling about such competence in work that Alexander's upbringing had taught him to dismiss as menial. The struggling ones, Alexander heard himself ask, what happens to them? The custodian paused, meeting Alexander's eyes in the mirror with a direct gaze that seemed to see through expensive suits and family names to something more fundamental. Depends on whether they're struggling because they don't know how to do the job or because they don't understand why the job needs doing. The distinction hit Alexander like cold water. He'd spent weeks focused on the how of business analysis, the formulas, the processes, the technical mechanics that everyone else seemed to grasp intuitively. But the why remained as mysterious as ever. Why did these numbers matter? Why did these analyses drive decisions that affected thousands of lives? Why did any of it exist beyond generating profits for people who already had more money than they could spend? "I'm Marcus," the custodian said, extending a hand that was calloused but clean. "Marcus Rodriguez. Alexander." The handshake was firm, honest, in a way that most of Alexander's business interactions weren't. "I work in acquisitions. Or I'm supposed to. I'm not very good at it." Marcus chuckled, a sound devoid of mockery. Most people aren't good at things they don't understand. And most people don't understand things they've never seen from the ground up. Over the following days, Alexander found himself seeking out these brief encounters. Marcus worked throughout the building, from the executive floors to the mailroom, from the cafeteria to the parking garage. He knew everyone's names, understood the company's rhythms in ways that went far deeper than organizational charts or profit margins. "You want to understand acquisitions?" Marcus asked one afternoon, as Alexander escaped another disastrous meeting with Sarah Chun. "Come with me." The freight elevator descended past floors Alexander had never visited, stopping at the building's mechanical levels, where the real work of keeping a 40-story office tower functioning happened daily. Boilers, air conditioning units, electrical systems, water pumps, the unglamorous infrastructure that made everything else possible. "Your company is trying to buy Morrison Industries," Marcus said, checking gauges on a massive air conditioning unit with the same attention Alexander had seen surgeons pay to patient monitors. "Morrison makes industrial heating systems. You know what that means?" Alexander shook his head, realizing he'd been analyzing financial projections for 3 weeks without understanding what the company actually did. "Means they make equipment like this." Marcus patted the humming machinery. Every office building, every factory, every hospital in cold climates needs heating systems. Not glamorous, but essential. You can't run a business if your employees are freezing. The revelation was simple but profound. Morrison Industries wasn't just numbers on a spreadsheet. It was a company that made things people actually needed. Their financial performance reflected their ability to solve real problems for real customers. But why would Worthington Industries want to buy them? Alexander asked, genuinely curious for the first time since starting the analysis. Marcus smiled, the expression of a teacher seeing comprehension dawn in a student's eyes. "Now you're asking the right question." They spent the next hour in the building's depths, while Marcus explained the logic Alexander had been missing. Worthington Industries owned office buildings, hotels, and commercial properties. When those properties needed heating systems, they paid companies like Morrison. By acquiring Morrison, they could control their own supply chain, reduce costs, and ensure quality control across their portfolio. "It's not about the numbers," Marcus explained, showing Alexander how to read the building's energy consumption reports. "Numbers are just the language business uses to talk about real things. People working in comfortable buildings, families staying in warm hotels, patients recovering in properly heated hospitals. The numbers tell you if you're helping people do those things better." For the first time, the Morrison Industries analysis began to make sense, not as an abstract puzzle, but as a story about companies serving customers who needed specific solutions to specific problems. Alexander found himself understanding the debt-to-equity ratios not as mathematical formulas, but as indicators of Morrison's ability to invest in better products for their customers. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Alexander still struggled with technical details, still made mistakes that made his colleagues wince. But something fundamental had shifted. Instead of seeing business analysis as an incomprehensible test designed to expose his inadequacy, he began to view it as detective work, uncovering the human needs and logical solutions hidden beneath layers of financial complexity. Marcus never presented himself as Alexander's teacher, never offered formal lessons or structured guidance. Instead, he shared observations during their brief encounters, pointed out connections Alexander had missed, asked questions that led to understanding rather than providing answers that led to dependence. "The best custodians," Marcus said one evening as they watched the sunset paint Manhattan's skyline gold and crimson, "aren't the ones who clean up the biggest messes. They're the ones who understand how messes happen and prevent them from getting that big in the first place. Alexander realized Marcus wasn't just talking about custodial work. October brought the first hint of autumn to Manhattan, and with it, a different Alexander Worthington III. The change wasn't dramatic. He still wore the same expensive suits, still occupied the same desk in acquisitions, still carried the same family name that opened doors and created expectations. But something essential had shifted in how he approached the work that had once seemed impossibly complex. The Morrison Industries analysis, which had sat on his desk like an indictment for weeks, was finally taking shape. Not because Alexander had suddenly mastered advanced financial modeling, but because he'd begun to understand the story the numbers were trying to tell. Under Marcus's subtle guidance, he'd learned to see beyond the spreadsheets to the actual business underneath. "You're getting better at this," Jennifer observed, reviewing Alexander's latest draft. Her tone carried genuine surprise rather than the forced encouragement she'd offered in earlier weeks. "Your risk assessment actually identifies real operational challenges instead of just repeating standard boilerplate." The improvement hadn't come from studying more textbooks or attending additional seminars. Instead, Marcus had introduced Alexander to a different kind of education, one that happened in service corridors and loading docks, in conversations with building engineers and maintenance supervisors, with security guards and food service workers. People whose jobs required them to understand how things actually worked, rather than how they appeared in executive presentations. "You want to analyze Morrison's operational efficiency," Marcus had suggested the previous week. "Talk to people who service industrial heating systems. They know which brands break down, which ones are built to last, which companies stand behind their warranties." So Alexander did something unprecedented in his privileged life. He started asking questions of people his family had taught him to ignore. The building's head of maintenance explained why certain heating systems required constant repairs, while others ran for years without problems. The security supervisor described how equipment failures affected building operations and tenant satisfaction. The food service manager detailed how kitchen heating systems impacted meal preparation and health code compliance. Each conversation added layers of understanding to the Morrison acquisition that no financial report could provide. Alexander began to see patterns that pure data analysis had missed: customer satisfaction trends that predicted future sales, operational inefficiencies that suggested improvement opportunities, market positioning advantages that weren't reflected in current profit margins. "Your analysis is starting to read like intelligence rather than calculation," Sarah Chin commented during their weekly review. For the first time since Alexander had joined her department, she seemed engaged rather than merely professional. "You're identifying strategic value that goes beyond the purchase price." The compliment felt different from the empty praise Alexander had received throughout his life. This was a recognition for his family name or inherited position. It was acknowledgment of work he'd actually done, insights he'd actually developed, value he'd actually created. But the real education was happening during his extended sessions with Marcus, conversations that had evolved from brief encounters to something approaching genuine mentorship. Marcus never positioned himself as Alexander's teacher. The dynamic remained informal, almost accidental. But his observations consistently revealed layers of wisdom that Alexander was only beginning to appreciate. "You know what separates successful custodians from mediocre ones?" Marcus asked one afternoon while they cleaned conference room windows that offered views of Central Park's changing foliage. "Mediocre ones focus on making things look clean. Successful ones focus on creating environments where important work can happen." The distinction seemed to apply to far more than custodial work. Alexander was beginning to understand that his previous failures hadn't resulted from inability to master technical skills, but from misunderstanding the purpose those skills served. Business analysis wasn't about demonstrating mathematical competence. It was about creating clarity that enabled better decisions. This shift in perspective began to affect every aspect of Alexander's work. When reviewing financial projections, he found himself asking not just whether the numbers were correct, but whether they provided the information decision-makers actually needed. When analyzing market trends, he considered not just statistical patterns, but the human behaviors and changing needs those patterns represented. The transformation didn't go unnoticed by his colleagues, though they struggled to identify exactly what had changed. Alexander still asked questions that seemed basic, still required help with technical procedures, still made mistakes that revealed his lack of traditional business education. But his questions were increasingly thoughtful, his requests for help more focused, his mistakes more instructive than embarrassing. He's finally starting to think like an analyst, instead of just trying to perform like one, Alexander overheard Jennifer telling another colleague. The comment stung slightly. He hadn't realized how transparent his earlier pretense had been, but it also validated the progress he was making. Marcus, characteristically, offered a different perspective on the improvement. "You're learning to see the building instead of just the blueprints," he observed during one of their evening conversations. Blueprints are important, but they can't tell you how people actually use the spaces, where the traffic patterns create wear, which systems get stressed beyond their design specifications. The metaphor resonated deeply with Alexander's experience. He'd spent years studying business blueprints, theories, models, frameworks, best practices, without understanding how those concepts translated into actual organizational life. Marcus was teaching him to observe the building itself, how decisions flowed through corporate hierarchies, where information bottlenecks created inefficiencies, which systems supported or hindered the human work they were meant to facilitate. This ground-level perspective began to reveal insights that Alexander's privileged background had obscured. He started to understand why certain strategic initiatives failed not because they were poorly conceived, but because they didn't account for operational realities. Why some acquisitions succeeded while others struggled not because of financial engineering, but because of cultural integration challenges. Why some business relationships thrived while others deteriorated not because of contract terms, but because of trust and communication patterns. "You're starting to ask the right questions," Marcus noted as October's final days brought the first frost to Manhattan streets. "Not the questions you think you should ask, but the questions that need asking." The distinction captured something essential about Alexander's evolution. He was learning to think independently rather than trying to perform competence he didn't possess. Instead of focusing on what successful people in his position were supposed to do, he was beginning to focus on what actually needed doing, and discovering that he might have something valuable to contribute after all. As November approached, bringing with it the halfway point of his father's 6-month deadline, Alexander found himself cautiously optimistic for the first time in years. Not because he'd suddenly mastered business analysis, he still had much to learn, but because he'd finally discovered how learning actually worked. And in Marcus Rodriguez, the unlikely custodian who saw buildings and people with equal clarity, he'd found a teacher who understood that true competence couldn't be inherited or purchased, only developed through patient observation and honest work. December in Manhattan arrived with the kind of bitter cold that tests both buildings and resolve. Alexander stood at his office window, watching snow dust the city streets 40 floors below, preparing for what would either validate months of growth or confirm his father's worst fears about his future in the family business. The Morrison Industries acquisition had evolved from an impossible puzzle into his signature project. Sarah Chun had assigned him to present the final analysis to the executive committee, the same board that had witnessed his previous failures, the same group whose disappointed faces had haunted his nightmares for months. "You ready for this?" Jennifer asked, reviewing the presentation materials one final time. Her tone carried genuine confidence now, a dramatic shift from the worried encouragement she'd offered during Alexander's early weeks in the department. The presentation was solid, comprehensive analysis backed by operational insights that went far beyond traditional financial modeling. Alexander had identified strategic synergies between Morrison's manufacturing capabilities and Worthington's property portfolio that could generate value for both companies. He'd uncovered operational inefficiencies that suggested immediate improvement opportunities. Most importantly, he developed an integration plan that addressed the human factors that typically determined whether acquisitions succeeded or failed. But preparation felt different this time. Instead of memorizing talking points and hoping to fake his way through questions, Alexander actually understood what he was presenting. The Morrison analysis wasn't just a collection of impressive-sounding business concepts. It was a roadmap for helping two companies serve their customers better while creating sustainable value for employees and shareholders. The numbers support the acquisition, he told Jennifer, gathering the presentation materials with hands that weren't shaking for the first time before a major meeting. But more importantly, the logic supports it. Morrison solves problems that our properties face every day. Bringing them into our organization makes sense for everyone involved. The transformation in his thinking was Marcus's influence, though the custodian would never claim credit for it. Through months of informal conversations and practical demonstrations, Marcus had taught Alexander to see business as an extension of the same logical principles that govern building maintenance. Understand what needs fixing, identify the root causes rather than just symptoms, develop solutions that address actual problems rather than theoretical concerns. Good analysis serves the organization, Marcus had explained while showing Alexander how building management systems collected and interpreted data from hundreds of sensors throughout the tower. Bad analysis serves the analyst's ego. The difference is whether you're trying to impress people or help them make better decisions. That distinction had become Alexander's guiding principle. Instead of crafting presentations designed to showcase his intelligence, he focused on providing information that would help the executive committee understand Morrison's strategic value. Instead of using complex financial jargon to demonstrate sophistication, he explained concepts in clear language that connected abstract analysis to concrete business benefits. The executive conference room on the 42nd floor looked exactly as it had during Alexander's previous disasters, but his relationship to the space had fundamentally changed. Where he'd once seen a tribunal designed to expose his inadequacy, he now saw a group of experienced business leaders who needed specific information to make an important decision. His father sat at the table's head, expression carefully neutral, but eyes revealing the cautious hope of a parent who'd witnessed too many disappointments to risk enthusiasm. The other board members, successful executives who'd built careers on their ability to distinguish substance from pretense, arranged themselves around the mahogany surface like judges preparing to render verdict on 6 months of Alexander's effort to prove he belonged in their world. Alexander, Charles began with formal courtesy. Please walk us through your Morrison Industries recommendation. The presentation began smoothly, with Alexander explaining Morrison's market position and financial performance in terms that demonstrated genuine understanding rather than rote memorization. He detailed their manufacturing capabilities, customer relationships, and competitive advantages without relying on consultant-prepared slides or borrowed insights. But the real test came during the question section, where previous presentations had devolved into exposed ignorance and executive frustration. This time, when board member Patricia Williams asked about integration challenges, Alexander was ready with specific answers based on actual research. Morrison's organizational culture emphasizes engineering excellence and customer service, he explained, referring to notes based on conversations with Morrison employees rather than theoretical frameworks from business school textbooks. Those values align well with our property management philosophy, but their decision-making processes are more centralized than ours. The integration plan addresses that difference by establishing cross-functional teams that preserve Morrison's technical autonomy while connecting them to our customer feedback systems. The response demonstrated something that had been missing from Alexander's previous presentations. Genuine expertise developed through patient investigation rather than superficial familiarity gained through cramming sessions. He could answer detailed questions because he'd done the detailed work necessary to understand both companies' actual operations. What about the financial projections? Asked CFO Robertson, Sarah's predecessor, and a man known for exposing weak analysis through relentless questioning. Your revenue synergy estimates are higher than industry benchmarks. How do you justify those assumptions? Alexander had anticipated this challenge, not because he'd memorized potential questions, but because he'd wrestled with the same concerns during his analysis. The projections reflect Morrison's current underutilization of their manufacturing capacity, he explained, displaying charts that showed actual production data rather than theoretical models. They're operating at 67% capacity because they focused on maintaining quality rather than maximizing volume. Our properties represent consistent demand that would let them increase production without compromising their standards or requiring additional capital investment. The explanation was technically accurate, but more importantly, it revealed Alexander's understanding of the human factors that made the numbers meaningful. Morrison wasn't just a collection of financial metrics. It was a company run by people who took pride in their work and needed customers who valued quality over cost efficiency. As the presentation continued, Alexander realized he was experiencing something unprecedented in his business career: genuine confidence based on actual competence. He wasn't performing the role of a successful analyst. He was actually being one, providing insights that helped the board understand strategic opportunities they might otherwise have missed. The questions became more detailed and challenging, but Alexander's responses remained grounded in real understanding rather than desperate improvisation. When asked about potential risks, he identified specific operational challenges and explained how the integration plan addressed them. When questioned about market assumptions, he referenced actual customer conversations rather than generic industry reports. "Impressive work," Patricia Williams said as the presentation concluded. "This is the most thorough acquisition analysis I've seen from our team in years. You've clearly done your homework." The praise felt different from any recognition Alexander had received before, earned rather than inherited, based on actual contribution rather than family obligation. But the real validation came from his father's expression, a mixture of relief and genuine pride that no amount of money could purchase or family connection could guarantee. After the board approved the Morrison acquisition unanimously, Alexander found himself alone in the conference room, watching snow continue to dust Manhattan's winter landscape. The city looked the same as it had 6 months earlier, but his relationship to it had been transformed. He was no longer an observer of other people's success. He was finally a contributor to meaningful work. Marcus appeared in the doorway, emptying trash bins with his characteristic quiet efficiency. "Congratulations," he said simply, the word carrying weight from someone who'd witnessed the entire transformation. "Thank you," Alexander replied, knowing the gratitude extended far beyond congratulations for a single successful presentation. "For everything." Marcus nodded, understanding the deeper acknowledgement. "You did the work. I just helped you see what was already there." As evening settled over Manhattan and the building's occupants departed for their homes, Alexander remained at the conference room window, finally understanding his place in the world that had seemed so foreign for so long. He wasn't the natural business genius his family had hoped to produce, but he discovered something more valuable: the ability to learn, to grow, and to contribute meaningfully to work that mattered. The custodian who taught him that lesson was already moving on to other tasks in other parts of the building, maintaining the infrastructure that made everything else possible. And Alexander Worthington III, no longer the golden failure, but not yet the leader he might become, began planning the next phase of a career built on understanding rather than inheritance, competence rather than privilege, and the simple wisdom that some of life's most important lessons come from the most unexpected teachers. The Morrison Industries integration would begin in January, and Alexander had real work to do. That if this story of transformation and unexpected mentorship resonated with you, hit that subscribe button and join our community of viewers who believe that wisdom can come from the most unlikely sources. Share this video with someone who might need to hear that failure isn't final, and growth is always possible when you're willing to learn from those around you. What unexpected mentor has changed your perspective? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to ring that notification bell for more inspiring true stories of personal transformation.